So let's talk about meltdowns. An autistic meltdown is when an autistic person becomes overloaded, and this can be because of a number of factors like sensory input or stress or anxiety. This can lead to what we call an autistic meltdown, which is a neurological event in which the brain cannot handle it anymore and just basically kind of loses control. Emily, what is your experience as an autistic adult of experiencing overload? How does that manifest for you?
Well, I think when people think of kind of autistic meltdowns, I think they often think of someone getting really angry and kind of maybe punching the wall and becoming quite visibly distressed, which is very much the case for some autistic people, and it has even been for me at times. But I think on a more day-to-day basis, it definitely presents in quite a lot of anxiety, and I think sometimes that can result in a meltdown where I get quite upset and emotional, I would say. But then sometimes I can also get quite angry at whoever is there trying to calm me down, and I can say things that I don't mean and that can be hurtful, and afterwards I'll feel quite bad about that. But those kind of meltdowns for me are kind of more rare, and it's more that high anxiety on a day-to-day basis that results in either panic attacks or even shutdowns, which is the opposite end of a meltdown. I always think of meltdowns as the fight response and kind of the fight or flight response. And I think of shutdowns as more the freeze response. And that shutdown is more where I'm just so overloaded, whether that's sensory wise, whether that's high demands and high anxiety. And I'll come home and I'll get under my weighted blanket and I just won't want to talk to anyone. Almost feels like my brain just slows right down. So I'd say that meltdowns and shutdowns for me are kind of quite interlinked, and I don't always know what's happening.
I feel like for me, I've always been curious about shutdowns in that I am someone who has meltdowns and very rarely shutdowns, and I always felt like shutdowns looked preferable. Would you say that either experience is more difficult than the other?
I think that shutdowns are more socially acceptable, or at least my shutdowns are, because I mask quite a lot and I tend to manage to suppress it all the emotions until I get home, and that's when it then comes out, other than panic attacks, which I think in some ways my body's response when I'm out in public, it's almost like how I respond in a bit of a meltdown is that actually the anxiety heightens and I suddenly can't breathe and I panic and I can't do anything. But then this is all emotions, isn't it? And as an autistic person, it's so hard to kind of identify those different emotions. We spoke about alexithymia before. But yeah, I do think that shutdowns are probably more socially acceptable than the meltdowns in general, because meltdowns are kind of can result in quite a lot of anger and visible distress, and shutdowns might be more internal. Though sometimes then you might get people not kind of wondering why someone's not speaking and are they putting that on and things like that.
From a clinical perspective, Hannah, what are the different ways that you've come across that autistic people might respond to overload, whether that's meltdowns or shutdowns or any other kind of manifestation?
It's really interesting about the term meltdowns because I think it covers so many different things, and I think Emily's touched upon that already. I think traditionally or historically, we've always seen meltdowns as that externalizing outward behaviour, whether it's hitting out or on the floor, banging legs or hitting walls or pulling hair. I've come to learn in my clinical experience and working with people is it looks so different for everybody. So I think the first thing is we have to understand what that is for that individual. I also wanted to mention terminology because I think the term meltdowns, I'm not sure it's always a particularly helpful term. Quite a lot of the people I work with say they do prefer the term overload and they don't like the term meltdowns. So I always try and ask how people want it termed and what it looks like for them. So meltdowns can be that externalized. So quite a lot of the young people I work with, it might be shouting, screaming, anger, hitting out or lashing out at people around them or at themselves as well. Quite a lot of self-injurious behaviour. But it can also be just overwhelmed crying. Like you mentioned emotions, Emily, and anger quite a lot of the time can be really overwhelming because not knowing how to verbalise the anger. So it's just uncontrollable crying, weeping for hours on end. And like you said, it can come under shutdown and meltdown. They can be two parts of the same thing, or they can be completely different. So one woman I work with just has shutdowns, that she just has shutdowns. She doesn't term it meltdown, she calls it overload. She shuts down. And for her, she actually quite likes that place she goes to because it enables her just to reset and not have to deal with anyone's input, any sensory input. And quite often, particularly girls and women, but I know men as well and non-binary individuals, they might take themselves to hide away. So under weighted blankets, go to bed, dark room, and that's their way of just saying to the world, I've had enough. From my experience from working with people, just observing what's happening, obviously I'm not in it, it's a message to say, I've had enough right now and I don't know how to communicate with anyone and I just need you all to back off.
For me, it's like, because I've been diagnosed for a long time, I've started to recognise what is kind of commonly known as the rumble stage of the meltdown, which is where I am starting to become a little bit irrational. Because for me, a meltdown feels like a complete loss of perspective. When I'm in meltdown, everything is terrible, everything always has been terrible, and everything always will be terrible, and there is no hope. That's how I feel in meltdown. And prior to that, there's a stage where I'm just incredibly irritated by like everything, by my clothes, by people around me, by the floor, by the sound of people breathing, you know? And at that point, I am able, if I know how to care for myself, to prevent a meltdown from happening. Whereas, and I think this is really important for people to understand, when you're in meltdown, there is nothing you can do about it. Do you feel like you have a rumble stage, and how would you describe that?
For me, I recognise what you're saying, the rumble stage, but for me, it doesn't present kind of like irritability. It's just anxiety. And I think that's what drives me most of the time, is anxiety. And I liked what you said about overload, because I think it's hard to separate, for me, it's hard to separate the meltdowns and the shutdowns, and it is just overload. And sometimes that shows externally and sometimes that's internally. So I think it can present physically. So I might appear more anxious, whether that's simply by jigging my leg a bit more, kind of needing to move a bit more, restlessness, I suppose. But also, I think it's mainly mental and internally. So my body might start to feel really tense. It's almost like I feel like burning sometimes inside of me. I'm like, I feel really, really, really on edge. I can't think coherently, I can't kind of make decisions, and suddenly being around so many people, I just suddenly find really overwhelming. And I think it's that overwhelm, and it's trying to recognise that before it reaches the point that you spoke about where you can't do anything about it, because there is that time where I can stop it from reaching that point. But yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah. I think one of the common misconceptions around meltdowns is that it is a manipulative behaviour designed to achieve a goal, right? And I think particularly one thing that people tend to do is compare them to temper tantrums. And I think that both of those behaviours are a form of communication of a need. And so they're both valid and they should be both taken seriously. But I think that the meltdown is particularly unique to autistic people and is not something that people can control. So if someone thinks that they can discipline someone out of a meltdown or somehow shame someone out of a meltdown, then that's something that they're very much mistaken about. And I think that can affect autistic people in like workplaces, in like the criminal justice system. Have you worked with anyone where that's been an issue?
Absolutely. And I do work with a lot of people that are diagnosed later, and I work in the forensic criminal justice system, and every time I'm coming across disciplining behaviour for those externalised meltdowns. And if you think about people that haven't yet got a diagnosis or are identified as neurodivergent, they're being punished every time for communicating that they're in distress and they need something. And that, time and time again, is so damaging to someone's self-esteem. We are conditioned to discipline bad behaviour. If a child is hitting out, pulling someone's hair at nursery, bad person. But actually, what we need to be doing is going back and unpicking what they're trying to tell us. And that's why earlier diagnosis is so important for people.
Unpick what's led to that situation, but also how else can they get those emotions out that's more safe and not putting other people at harm. For me, I feel like it's just a response that you can't help. Almost your body and your brain go into because you've had so much sensory overload and so many demands in the day, and actually your brain just doesn't know how to process that. And we know that autistic brains kind of process more information at once than neurotypical brains. So when you think about how much more information in a day you're processing than someone who isn't autistic, it's no wonder your brain goes into overdrive. And that's what happens with me. My brain just completely gets overloaded and shuts down, and it's a response.
So when you've had a meltdown, or when you're seeing an autistic person have a meltdown, probably a better way of viewing it is that this person's needs have not been met. how can we move forward in a way that means their needs are met and this doesn't happen again. And as the autistic person, rather than carrying shame and feeling like you have done something wrong, understanding that having needs is valid and finding ways to meet them is reasonable, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely. It's key.
So you must have seen a million different overload triggers in your work with autistic people. Can you speak to that a little bit, please, Hannah?
There are so many. And things that probably we don't think are a trigger. I think that's the thing I constantly find in my work is I'm learning all the time that something I think is banal or inane to someone is actually a huge trigger. So it can be things like when we say sensory, we're talking about a lot of sensory things. So that can be noise, but it can be demands in a day. It can be things you've got to do. It can be number of people you have to interact with that day. And it could be eating, smells of food. If you go and meet friends for a meal, background noise, the smell of the food, the experience of eating the food, that can trigger a shutdown quite a lot in a lot of the girls and women I work with. We're not just thinking about noise, though it is a massive factor for a lot of people. We're thinking about that general overload of things, having to meet deadlines, having to go to meetings, having to interact with people. That can be hugely, hugely triggering. So often someone might get through a day, do everything they're meant to do and go home and absolutely shut down or overload. And that's the cost of having to get through that day. But it also can be about conflict sometimes as well. So things that linger in your head. There's been an interaction with somebody you care about or someone at work and it's not gone very well. And then you'll ruminate on it and then you'll go home and you'll sit with it. And that can lead also to types of overload and shutdown.
I think it's really important to remember as well that it doesn't have to be just one trigger. In fact, it's usually not just one trigger.
Yeah.
I always describe my meltdowns as like a slow drip until the cup is full and I just can't handle it anymore. And quite often, the kinds of things that cause me to melt down are multiple noise sources. I find that really difficult. And also, if I get into flow state, which is where I think particularly for neurodivergent people, we can get into a state where we're really involved in what we're doing, and then someone interrupts me when I'm in that state, that can really trigger me to be overloaded because my brain has to suddenly shift direction.
yeah.
And I think, Emily, you were talking about how not being aware that you're hungry or thirsty, like interoception. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I think interoception is one of the things that makes me more likely to have a meltdown. If you're hungry, people talk about kind of being hangry and things like that, but for a lot of autistic people, they might not be able to recognize when they are hungry because that interoception, the difficulty kind of identifying how you're feeling and internal bodily feelings, and then combined with alexithymia, kind of difficulty recognizing emotions, I think those two things together can just really make meltdowns more likely. I think triggers in itself for me is really any kind of overload. So whether that's sensory overload, whether it's an overload in demands, an overload in expectations, or even just an overload of emotions, no matter what that emotion is. I think it's just a variety of triggers. And like you said, it all builds up throughout the day. It might be a really busy week and you've got so many different environments you're going to, new people you're meeting, different noises, different expectations, high anxiety, and kind of living in that state of such high anxiety and feeling out of control. And
Possibly masking.
Masking. And then you throw a little noise in there and it's like, oh, the noise was the trigger. But actually, the noise was the trigger in that moment, might have been the last factor, but it's because of all of those things that have built up over that time.
Which is why people perceive these meltdowns as unreasonable or overloads as unreasonable, right? Because they're saying this person has reacted in this massive way to this minor thing, but they're not taking into account the huge amount of things that led to them being in the state where they couldn't handle that minor thing. I also have ADHD. I know that you mentioned that you do too, Emily. So for me, the key to dealing with overload is actually adjusting my life to prevent overload happening too often. And that means thinking about my whole week in terms of how much I'm expected to do, what kind of sensory environments I'm going to be in, and preparing myself to be able to cope with those. Emily, how would you say that you kind of navigate keeping your brain happy, for want of a better way of putting it?
So I think I've been lucky enough to be able to adapt my life to make it kind of work for me. So I do work in an office, but I work part-time and I work a job that is manageable for me. And I've developed coping strategies to manage, which takes different people different amount of time. And it doesn't mean that I never melt down at all. It just means that I know what I need at certain times. So I know that some days, at the weekend especially, I need just a day of not talking to anyone. And I just need to kind of period of time where I don't have those demands or those expectations. And then in between that, it's just making life autism friendly, isn't it? It's wearing clothes you feel comfortable in. I surround myself with people that I feel comfortable with and that I can unmask around. Again, something I'm very privileged to kind of have those people in my life. I think a key thing for me has been not just other people reducing their expectations, but me reducing my own expectations of myself, and saying to myself that it's okay to not be doing what everyone else is doing. It's okay to not be going out on the weekends to kind of loud places and bars and stuff if you don't want to, and just filling my life with stuff that I know rejuvenates me. So whether that's linked to my special interests, because I think that's a great way to calm down and prevent those meltdowns from escalating.
Hannah, as a clinician, could you possibly offer us some kind of practical tips that the people watching can take away that they could maybe implement right now that might help them to remain regulated in their lives?
I learn from the people I work with, they teach me. And interestingly, I was working with a woman recently who has learned what makes her shut down. She's privileged enough that she's had that time to work that out because she was actually late diagnosed. So she had to come up with strategies to understand what made her meltdown or shut down or overload. So for instance, she recently had a baby and she was able to recognise that she would probably be overloaded during labour. And so she warned the midwives not to touch her or to touch her as little as possible because she knew that would trigger her. So she was able to implement something before she went into that very overloading situation. The thing is about that is that she's been able to recognise that in herself and then communicate it. And I think that's one of the most difficult things that I'm sure you both have experienced, is that process of learning what it is that makes us reach that overload. Particularly, I'm working with 2 teenage girls who've recently been diagnosed. And what we're doing is we're building what I call a communication and sensory passport. And what that we do is we go through methodically triggers, we talk about recent experiences, and we try to build almost a map, sometimes do it visually or we do it in writing, where we start to learn what it is that makes the triggering of overload. And then we work out how to reduce that in their life, but also how to communicate that to parents, to school, to friends in a way they feel comfortable with. So I think from my experience of working with people, it is all about learning to recognise the triggers and know when to ask for help or space and what you need during those times. I think you said earlier really helpfully, it's not helpful to tell someone to stop, which often people do. But the thing is, unfortunately, you do have to go through a process of discovery, and that can be quite challenging and painful in order to get to that point of insight and knowledge about yourself. But it is all about building a picture. So I'll often tell families or individuals I'm working with is start writing down, even if it's after the overload, try and think back earlier in that day and pinpoint what it was so that next time we can think, okay, you woke up without very much sleep and then you had to go straight to school and then you had to go to that lesson with that teacher that doesn't affirm you and make you feel good about yourself. So let's think about that and break that down and maybe try and change that morning. Or adults who are going to a workplace where they're, again, not affirming them. I think you said earlier, Emily, about being around people that do affirm you and make you feel good. I think that's one of the key things, is learning who those people are.
I think it's really useful to notice that even when we're implementing all these strategies, we can still get overloaded. And I think that when I was trying to figure out how to support myself, sometimes I got into like an overly perfectionist way of thinking of I'm going to do these things and then I'm going to be a human that can function all the time. And there are no humans that can function all the time. So with the best will in the world, we're still probably going to experience overload and shutdown. So let's talk a little bit about the kinds of things that we might do either in preparation for when that happens, during or after those experiences. So for me personally, one of the things that I tend to do in meltdown is hit my head. I'm saying this on camera. It doesn't make me feel comfortable, but I want to be honest about how that looks for me. And so what I've had to think about is, what am I getting from doing that I can replicate in a way that is safe and is not harmful, right? So I've started leaving things that I can punch around my house, because with the best will in the world, when I'm in meltdown, I'm not going to go, I'm going to go in my cupboard and fetch my thing that I can punch and put it in this place so that I can use it. So I've started just leaving like little meltdown packs around my house in preparation that I'm in the room, and if it's right in front of me, I might use it. Is there anything that you know that you will access if it's easy for you to access when you're feeling shut down or if you're feeling overloaded?
My go-to is always my weighted blanket and my headphones. Sometimes it's putting on a Netflix show that I'm watching. So I've had quite a few obsessions, well, more maybe hyperfixations, that I just get really invested in the show and I just want to watch it all the time. And actually being able to do something like that I find really calming is really helpful.
And do you find that when you're in that experience, your brain remembers that will be helpful?
If I'm at home, that is automatically where I will go. The problem is when I'm out, I think, and that's when I find it quite difficult. If I'm out, my go-to will be my car. And actually, yeah, I think I've just programmed that I need to get away. I've always been a flee to where I feel safe. So when I'm out, that'll be my car. Or if I'm at home, it'll be my weighted blanket. And then I'll put in my headphones and I'll just try and shut off from the world.
So do you think that because you've always used these strategies, almost you've kind of got into a bit of a routine that you're not having to second guess yourself? And so if someone was wanting to implement ways to support themselves, if they could repeatedly do the same thing enough times, it might become like habitual. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, or kind of look at what you do now. So like exactly how you did, you looked at the fact that you kind of hit your head and you tried to work out how you could adapt that to safely. So I looked at how I would run off or run away and not be in the safest environment, and how can I adapt that? So where can I go that's safe and where I can decompress a bit?
I think it's really important also to consider like post overload or post shutdown, because I know that for me personally, if I've had like an explosive experience because I've been overloaded, then the chances of that happening again during the period of 24 to 48 hours after that is so much higher. It's like I'm not regulated, there's still adrenaline in my brain, I'm still a bit overstimulated, so I've got to care for myself even more carefully. Hannah, can you speak to that a little bit for me, please?
Sometimes I'll work with a family and sometimes I'll work with an individual, or even it comes up in diagnostic assessments, is this huge amount actually of guilt and shame that comes around the bit afterwards. Because everyone, as we said earlier, overload, shutdown, meltdowns look very different for everyone, but sometimes in those times people can do things they wouldn't normally do. They do things they might be ashamed of or regret, say things, hit out. For instance, I worked with one mum who was diagnosed very late. Her meltdowns were very sensory seeking. So she would want to bite people. Sometimes that was her children. So the guilt that came around that and the anxiety, the shame was huge, and that caused quite severe mental health breakdowns. So in order for her to deal with that, she learnt that she needed a whole day off being a mum and a partner in life, and that was her brain reset day, is what she called it. But that enabled her the other days to keep that to a minimum. But what's really important, I think, particularly for anyone surrounding that person, is to diminish the shame and the guilt around what's happened, to understand it's part of a journey and a process. They're not doing it on purpose, and to make them feel really safe and calm and do what they need to recover and heal from that experience. Because the chances of another shutdown or overload within that day or so afterwards are very high, and particularly if things are not being monitored and supported in the right way. So it's not making the person feel utterly terrible for that experience.
Yeah, I think that's really true. Like for me, I like to think of myself as a reasonable, compassionate and loving person, except for when I'm in meltdown, when I'm really not very easy to be around at all. And I am a parent and I am a partner, and the shame, it like comes in waves. So immediately after the meltdown, I'm kind of still just recovering. But then that evening, maybe I'll just be lying watching TV and I almost get like flashbacks because I don't remember the meltdown completely clearly. So I get like flashbacks of the things that I've done and the things that I've said, and it makes me feel so small and terrible. But my partner will say to me when I say like, gosh, why on earth would you want to deal with this when you could not? He'll say, this is a very small part of who you are. The overall picture is that you're pretty awesome. And then there's this little tiny thing, and we've all got little things that people have to deal with. It's just that yours is loud, and that's okay. And so he does do the work to try and help me feel okay in myself. And over time, I'm trying to learn to offer myself compassion and forgiveness and understanding after these events as well. Emily, how do you feel if you've had an experience where maybe you've behaved in ways that you don't feel represent you the way that you would like them to?
Terrible. I will feel terrible about myself. It's embarrassing as well if other people have been there, and that makes me feel guilty and ashamed, and I think self-hatred as well comes up, which is hard to work through. And I think it can really affect autistic people's self-esteem. I know that it has affected mine a lot, because you think that's not who I am as a person. Actually, I didn't mean what I said. And if it's something that's happened publicly, for me, it's usually panic attacks. I just feel embarrassed and kind of think, oh, like, they must think I'm such a pain. Working through all that, normally it's just time, I think, and it's allowing it to settle in. Okay, that happened, and just, tomorrow it won't be such a big deal. Day after that, it will be even less of a big deal. It's just right this minute it is a big deal to you. And it's just self-validating that and kind of trying to shift your attention onto something that's a little bit more joyful.
I think that's really true. I think definitely distraction and just don't think about it are really good tips. I think it's also really important to just think about self-care in the post-overload period, and that's getting rest, and that's eating well, and that's doing things that make you feel good, like engaging with your special interests and meeting your sensory needs. Would you agree with that, Hannah?
Absolutely. The thing with self-care is it covers a broad number of terms and is different for everyone. So understanding what your self-care is, I think Emily said before about a Netflix series, that's definitely my self-care as well, disappear into a series and shut the world off. And I think it's knowing what you need and being able to ask that, other people around you knowing it without having to ask you, and just know that that's what you need for that following day or so. But it's so important to put yourself first and not feel guilty for having occupy space. I think that's been such a common thing for a lot of people. Again, particularly I think girls and women and non-binary people, is like, you're taking up space, you're getting attention seeking by doing this, and actually what you need is real healing and care and love.
I almost have like a mental checklist in my head for after I've had either kind of a meltdown, shutdown, panic attack, whatever you call it. And those things on the list are things like sleep, have something to eat, wash your face or have a shower if you can, but normally that's too much demand, so wash your face. Remove as many demands as possible, engage in your special interest, meet your sensory needs, so hiding away, comfy clothes, and then just not demanding anything from yourself. And that's almost what I need to recover, I think, from meltdowns.
I think having a literal checklist is probably really good advice. You could make yourself a literal checklist, and I think then giving yourself permission that a significant thing has happened that you do need to give yourself care for, and going through that list. And obviously everyone isn't privileged enough to be able to take a full day off when they've been overloaded. But even if you can just meet one or two things on those lists in amongst the responsibilities that you have, it's going to be better than just trying to plow on and pretend that nothing happened. One thing I've noticed is that when I get overloaded on my own, it tends to escalate less than when I get overloaded around other people. And particularly, I am married, so particularly around my husband, because if I were around other people, I would tend to run away, as we discussed earlier. And the way that he interacts with that overload can really make a massive difference to how much it escalates and what it leads to. So as a clinician, what advice would you give to someone who is supporting an autistic person who is experiencing overload?
This again is a learning process because everyone's different in what they need. And if you're fortunate enough that you've been able to work out together, whether you're the parents or siblings or partner, then you can say, like, look, this is what I need and don't need. The main thing I've learned, not to diminish what's happening in the moment. Don't ever, I would say, tell someone to stop overloading, stop melting down, to just stop the behaviour. It's probably one of the worst things you can do. You do have to let them go through it. So respect the process, respect what they're going through, respect what they're telling you. If there is no hitting out or harming behaviour either to themselves or you involved, let it play out, give them as much space as they're telling you. Be around, be mindful and respectful and loving, but from a distance until they've gone through it, and then work on the recovery and healing together. If they are hurting themselves or you, that is much more difficult to deal with, because again, I would say don't stop them doing it necessarily, but find a safer way for it to be happening. So if somebody is hitting themselves, sometimes what I've done is try to slip a pillow or something soft in between them and their hand. So if they want to continue hitting until they're ready to stop, they're at least doing it on softer material and not themselves. If they're hitting you, again, you can put something between you and them or leave the space altogether until they're ready to come back to you.
I think another thing that can be quite tricky is that sometimes overload escalates out of a heightened situation. So for me and my partner, we might be having a discussion that turns into an argument, that turns into a meltdown. And so we have worked together. We've been married for 22 years now. Okay. So we have worked together to figure out how to handle what is obviously a meltdown that is not escalated in that way. I'm ranting and he feels like maybe I'm actually telling him problems, or maybe I'm actually looking for advice, or maybe we're actually arguing. It can be quite hard for him to identify this is a meltdown and I need to go into the meltdown plan that we have made. And that is often when things have gone wrong, when he's looking for rationality in a situation that cannot be rational. I don't know what the answer to that is, because we haven't found it yet, but I wanted to speak to that because I feel like this might be something that happens to other people, and to let them know that, they're not alone. I know that one of the things that we have done is come up with a meltdown plan so that he feels empowered, that he can take action that might help when I'm in meltdown. And for us, what that looks like is, I really like stupid dog and cat videos on YouTube, and for him to not say anything to me and to put those videos on will usually work. And I might be literally yelling, I do not wish to see funny cats right now, what are you doing? And he has to not listen at all and continue to follow the plan. And I think that's really tricky for people when they're supporting autistic people. Is there anything you would say, Hannah, in terms of empowering people, that if they've made a meltdown plan, it is okay to just keep going?
Absolutely, Ella. I think that is, in my experience, when I've been on the other side of it, it is incredibly difficult if someone's screaming the opposite at you to keep going. But you have to have trust in that person when they're not having the overload and shut down. Trust that human, that they've told you what they need. Respect that. I've always just gone with it and kept going. And afterwards, usually it's a good and positive outcome. They're grateful that you have stuck to your word, because also if you break the plan that you've made together, you're sort of saying you don't trust them, and you're saying you're not listening to them. And I think that's another trigger. So you're telling them in that moment that, yes, I know you're telling me the opposite and you're screaming, but I'm going to go with what we've decided when you told me this is what you needed.
That's so true. And it's definitely going to be empowering. I know that for my partner, one of the things that he's said is that when he's gotten to that end and it has worked and the situation has de-escalated, he feels more confident and he feels happier and empowered that he can support me, which obviously is what he wants to do because he loves me. And when he hasn't supported me and it has escalated, he feels really like he's let me down. So I think having success in these areas can really build that confidence. Is there anything you would like to say about this?
It kind of depends on the situation and what has kind of triggered the meltdown. So it's difficult, I think, if someone just walks in and they don't really know what's happened. And we know that it can be so many different build-ups. But often for me, there'll be some kind of situation or something that will have just triggered something and a thought. And actually, if I am really worked up and in a meltdown, like you've kind of mentioned before, the rationality doesn't really work. I honestly just need someone to validate it. So I need them to go, yeah, it's hard, it's horrible, I get you, it's okay that you're stressed, it's okay, I understand why you're feeling like that. And then to go, let's just take some time to breathe and calm down. What can you do? What do you know that helps you? And then let's talk about it when you're a bit calmer, because there's no use talking about anything that is kind of stressing you out when you're in that space. And that's where the anger ends up coming out towards other people around me. So I've been with my boyfriend 2.5 years now, and he's had to learn, I suppose, how I react to different things. And he's done that really well. And he knows, actually, yeah, I'm not going to give you advice and rationalise this right now. I'm going to validate you. We'll talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think that's also a great demonstration of how different things work for different people, and therefore how valuable it is to make meltdown plans with our loved ones ahead of time. Because if someone started to say to me, oh yeah, I can understand, I'd be like, oh yeah, that's true then. The world is broken and everything I'm saying is true. For me, anyone saying anything or any kind of input is too much. So I need complete silence, cat videos and tea and nothing else. So I think if you are supporting an autistic person, or you love an autistic person and you want to make this process as pain-free as possible, having those conversations at calm times when you are able to discuss what might work is really, really valuable. If you found this video helpful, please like, consider subscribing to the channel, and check out the description box for more information.